The silence in my apartment was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smelled of stale coffee and my own quiet desperation. It had been my constant companion for years, a familiar ache I had learned to live with. Loneliness was a language I was fluent in, my life a series of routines designed to keep the silence from screaming. Wake up, work from home, eat alone, sleep. Repeat. The only real variable, the only unpredictable splash of color in my monochrome existence, was Alex. And for 10 years, Alex had been the source of all my joy and most of my pain. He called me on a Tuesday, his voice a low rumble through the phone that vibrated straight through my sternum. "She's gone, Leo," just that. 3 words that shattered the carefully constructed peace of my afternoon. Sarah, the latest in a long line of girlfriends I had learned to tolerate with a practiced, hollow smile, had finally left. I should have felt something akin to relief, or even a vindictive flicker of satisfaction. Instead, all I felt was the familiar, gut-wrenching lurch of empathy for him, for the pain I could hear simmering beneath that single, tight sentence. "I'm sorry, man," I said, the words inadequate, plastic. "What happened?" "The usual," he sighed, a gust of static and frustration. Said I was distant, unavailable. You know the drill. I did. I knew it intimately. I had watched him cycle through relationships, each one starting with a bright, hopeful flame and sputtering out into the same pile of ashes, the same complaint. He was there, but he wasn't. Present, but absent. I knew why, of course. Or at least, I had a theory I'd clung to in the dark for a decade, a foolish, desperate hope I never dared to speak aloud. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my fingers tracing the rim of my cold coffee mug. "Get out of here. I'm going up to the cabin for a week. To think. Or not think. I don't know the cabin." The word alone conjured 1,000 memories. Summers spent by the lake, winters huddled by the fire, the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. It was his family's place, a rustic A-frame nestled deep in the woods, miles from anywhere. It was their sanctuary, our sanctuary. "And you're coming with me," he added, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. My heart did a stupid little flip. "Alex, I don't know. You probably need to be alone." It was a lie. The last thing I wanted was for him to be alone. The last thing I wanted was for me to be alone. No, that's the last thing I need. I need normal. I need a friend. Please, Leo. The please was what did it. Alex didn't plead. He was all quiet confidence and steady resolve. Hearing that crack in his voice, that sliver of raw vulnerability, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. "Okay," I heard myself say, the word leaving my mouth before my brain could raise its usual objections. "Okay, I'll come." An hour later, I was at his apartment, a duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The place was a disaster, a testament to the emotional explosion that had clearly taken place. A cushion was on the floor, a half-empty wine glass sat on a stack of mail. Sarah's absence was a tangible presence, marked by the empty space on the bookshelf where her pretentious poetry anthologies used to be, the missing pink toothbrush from the holder in the bathroom. Alex was stuffing clothes into a backpack, his movements jerky and efficient. He hadn't shaved. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw, making him look older, more rugged, tired. I stood in the doorway of his bedroom, just watching him. It was a familiar pastime of mine, observing Alex in his natural habitat. I watched the way the muscles in his back shifted under his gray t-shirt as he reached for a pair of jeans. I watched his hands, strong and capable, as they folded a sweater with practiced ease. He had painter's hands, I always thought, though he worked in finance. Long fingers, slightly calloused, with clean, short nails. Hands that could fix a leaky faucet or build a perfect campfire. Hands I had imagined holding mine more times than I could count. He turned and saw me watching. A faint, weary smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were the color of moss after a rain, and right now, they looked clouded over. "Hey, thanks for coming." "Of course," I said, my voice a little too thick. I cleared my throat. "Anytime." He ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair, a habit he had when he was stressed. "I just need to grab a few more things. Beer is in the fridge if you want 1 inch." I didn't want a beer. I wanted to go over there, wrap my arms around him, and tell him it would all be okay. I wanted to press my face into the curve of his neck and breathe in that scent that was uniquely him, a mix of cedarwood soap and something else, something warm and musky that was just Alex. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I gave him a nod and retreated to the living room, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, the silence between us filled with the ghosts of a decade of unspoken things. This was our dynamic. He was the sun I orbited, and I was the quiet, unassuming moon, content to reflect his light and never ask for more. A week at the cabin, just the two of us. The thought was both a dream and a nightmare, a terrifying, beautiful thing. The drive north was a long, quiet affair. Alex put on some generic indie rock station that played fuzzy, melancholic songs, a fitting soundtrack for the mood inside the cab of his truck. He drove with a casual, one-handed competence, his other arm resting on the open window, the wind ruffling the sleeve of his flannel shirt. I watched the dense green of the forest blur past, the tall pines standing like silent sentinels on either side of the winding road. I kept my gaze fixed out the passenger window, but my awareness was entirely centered on the man beside me. I was acutely conscious of the space between us, a gap of maybe 6 inches on the worn bench seat that felt both like a chasm and a dangerously small distance. Every time he shifted gears, his arm would move, and the rough fabric of his shirt would brush against my sleeve. Each accidental contact sent a tiny jolt through my system, a spark I had to consciously ignore. I studied his profile when I thought he wasn't looking. The straight line of his nose, the firm set of his jaw under the dark stubble, the way a few strands of his dark hair fell across his forehead. He had a small, pale scar just above his eyebrow from a childhood fall, a detail I doubted any of his girlfriends had ever truly noticed. I noticed everything. This was my curse, to be a cataloger of details, an archivist of his micro-expressions. I could tell by the subtle tightening of his lips that he was replaying arguments with Sarah in his head. I could see the exhaustion in the slight slump of his shoulders, a weariness that went deeper than just a lack of sleep. I knew the rhythm of his breathing, the way it deepened when he was lost in thought. I knew him better than anyone, and yet, he didn't know the first thing, the most important thing, about me. "You're quiet," he said after an hour of near-total silence, his voice startling me out of my reverie. I turned to look at him. He glanced over, his moss-green eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second before returning to the road. "Just thinking," I said, which was the truest thing I could say. "About what?" "About you. About us. About how this week is going to destroy me. About work." I lied, the falsehood tasting like ash in my mouth. "Got a big project deadline coming up." He nodded, accepting the lie without question. "You work too hard." It was a familiar refrain. He was always telling me to get out more, to live a little. He didn't understand that my life was small by design, a fortress built to protect my fragile heart from the one person most likely to break it. Says the man who regularly pulls 12-hour days. I countered, a bit of our old banter returning. A genuine smile, small but real, finally graced his lips. Touché. The tension eased slightly after that. We talked about trivial things, a stupid movie we'd seen, a friend's recent engagement, the ridiculous price of gas. It was safe territory, the well-worn path of our friendship. I found myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my stomach loosening its grip. This was easy. This was familiar. I could do this. I could be his friend, his rock. I could push my own feelings down, lock them away in the basement of my heart where they belonged. I had been doing it for 10 years, after all. What was one more week? We arrived at the cabin as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows through the trees. Alex killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a loon from the lake. The air that drifted in through the open window was cool and crisp, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of my happiest memories. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, made of dark, weathered logs, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built by Alex's grandfather with his own 2 hands. It felt like a part of the forest, not something imposed upon it. "Home sweet home," Alex murmured, though his voice was laced with a melancholy that undercut the words. We got out and began to unload our bags and the coolers of food and beer we brought. We moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, a rhythm developed over years of camping trips and shared projects. I grabbed my duffel and a case of beer. He hauled the heavy cooler. As I walked past him toward the porch steps, his free hand came up and rested for a moment on the small of my back, a simple, guiding gesture. "Watch that loose board," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. My entire body went rigid. The warmth of his hand seeped through my shirt, a focused point of heat that seemed to burn straight through to my skin. It was an entirely casual, friendly touch, the kind of touch friends give each other all the time. But for me, it was electric. It was a brand. My mind went into overdrive, analyzing the gesture from every possible angle. Was it just a friendly warning? Or was there something more in the way his fingers seemed to press, just for a second, before he pulled his hand away? I am going to lose my mind. I stumbled up the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Got it," I managed to say, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar to my own ears. I didn't look back at him. I couldn't. I hurried inside, the scent of cedar and dust and old memories enveloping me. The cabin was cool and dark. I dropped my bag on the floor and stood in the center of the main room, taking a deep, shaky breath, trying to get myself under control. One touch. That's all it took. One meaningless, friendly touch, and the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart were already starting to crumble. This week was going to be so much harder than I had imagined. The first few days at the cabin settled into a quiet, domestic rhythm. We fell into our old roles easily. I was the cook. He was the handyman. I made coffee in the ancient percolator while he went out in the crisp morning air to chop firewood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe splitting logs became the soundtrack to my mornings, a strangely comforting and deeply masculine sound that seemed to reverberate in my chest. I would watch him from the kitchen window, his body a study in fluid motion. The easy swing of his arms, the way his shoulders bunched and released, the focused set of his jaw. He moved with a purpose and a physical confidence that I, with my lanky frame and indoor job, had always envied. I spent an inordinate amount of time watching him. It was a terrible habit, but one I couldn't seem to break. I watched him as he fixed the sticking screen door, his brow furrowed in concentration, a stray lock of dark hair falling over his forehead. I watched him as he stood on the dock, skipping stones across the glassy surface of the lake, his silhouette stark and lonely against the setting sun. I watched him as he sat across from me by the fire in the evenings, the flickering light dancing in his green eyes, making them look like chips of jade. My internal monologue was a relentless, exhausting hum of analysis. Every glance, every word, every gesture was put under a microscope. When he passed me a beer, did his fingers linger against mine for a moment too long? When he laughed at one of my stupid jokes, was the smile that reached his eyes genuine, or just a polite reflex? He had a habit of looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze steady and unreadable. I'd feel the weight of it on my skin, and when I'd turn to meet his eyes, he'd look away quickly, a faint flush sometimes coloring his cheeks. My heart would leap into my throat every time it happened. Hope, that treacherous, beautiful bastard, would whisper in my ear. He feels it too. But then my rational brain, the one that had protected me for a decade, would shout it down. "Don't be an idiot, Leo. He just broke up with his girlfriend. He's vulnerable. He's your best friend. You're reading into things. You're projecting." The touches continued, small and fleeting and utterly devastating. A hand on my shoulder as he leaned over to look at the book I was reading, our knees brushing under the small kitchen table as we ate breakfast. One afternoon, we decided to take the old canoe out on the lake. As I was getting in, I wobbled, and his hand shot out to steady me, his grip firm on my bicep. "Whoa, careful there," he said, his voice a low rumble. His hand stayed there for a few seconds longer than necessary, his thumb stroking absently against my arm. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. I could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, the slight roughness of his calluses against my skin. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. The scent of the lake, the feel of the sun on my face, the sound of the water lapping against the hull, it all faded into the background. All that existed was the pressure of his hand on my arm. I looked up at him, and his eyes were dark, his expression intense. The playful smile was gone, replaced by something I couldn't decipher. Something raw. It felt like we were on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath our feet. My heart was pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. "Say something. Do something." Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment was gone. He blinked, dropping his hand as if he'd been burned. He cleared his throat and looked away, out toward the middle of the lake. "We should get going before the wind picks up," he said, his voice suddenly brisk, businesslike. I nodded mutely, my arm tingling where he had touched me. I settled into my seat at the front of the canoe, my back to him, and picked up my paddle. We rowed in silence for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic splash of our paddles dipping into the water. The silence was different now. It wasn't comfortable anymore. It was charged, heavy with the weight of what had just passed between us, or what I imagined had passed between us. I felt like I was going insane, trapped in a feedback loop of hope and doubt. On the third day, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, turned a bruised, sullen gray. We had decided to hike to a scenic overlook a few miles from the cabin. We were halfway there when the weather turned. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees with a low, mournful howl, and the temperature dropped a good 15 degrees in as many minutes. "We should turn back," Alex said, his voice raised to be heard over the rising wind. He zipped up his jacket, his gaze scanning the ominous-looking clouds that were rolling in over the ridge. But it was too late. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. We were soaked in seconds. The rain was icy cold, and it plastered our clothes to our skin, instantly chilling us to the bone. The trail turned to mud beneath our feet, and the wind drove the rain into our faces, making it hard to see. "This way," Alex yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me off the trail toward a large outcropping of rocks. We scrambled under the overhang, huddling together in the small, sheltered space as the storm raged around us. We were both shivering violently, our teeth chattering. The space was cramped, forcing us into a proximity that was far beyond our usual boundaries. Our shoulders were pressed together, our thighs flush against each other. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold that was seeping into my bones. "Damn," he breathed, his voice shaky from the cold. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the rain that dripped from his soaked hair. "This is not ideal." I tried to laugh, but it came out as a stuttering gasp. "You think?" He looked at me, his eyes full of concern. "You're freezing." Without another word, he shifted, moving closer to me, and wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me against his side. "Huddle up. We need to share body heat." My brain short-circuited. This was not a fleeting, ambiguous touch. This was a deliberate, sustained embrace. He was holding me. His arm was a solid, heavy weight around my shoulders, his side pressed firmly against mine. I could feel the hard muscle of his chest, the steady, strong beat of his heart against my arm. I tucked my head down, resting my cheek against the cold, wet fabric of his jacket, and breathed in the scent of him, now mingled with the clean, earthy smell of rain and wet leaves. My shivering began to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor, one that started deep in my core and radiated outward. It wasn't from the cold. It was from him, from the overwhelming, terrifying intimacy of the moment. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, listening to the storm, not speaking. There was nothing to say. The situation had stripped away all pretense, all the carefully constructed barriers between us. We were just two people, cold and wet, seeking warmth and shelter in each other. After a few minutes, he spoke, his voice a low murmur against my hair. "Better." I could only nod, unable to trust my voice. I felt raw, exposed. All my defenses were down. In that small, dark space, with the storm raging outside and his arm around me, the love I had kept hidden for so long felt like a physical entity, a living, breathing thing that was filling up all the space between us. It was terrifying, and it was the safest I had ever felt in my entire life. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The rain tapered off to a drizzle, and a sliver of watery sunlight broke through the clouds. We trudged back to the cabin in a soggy, contemplative silence. The arm Alex had wrapped around me was gone, but I could still feel the phantom weight of it, a ghost of warmth against my shoulders. The air between us was thick with a new kind of awareness. Something had shifted. The ground beneath our feet had changed, and I had no idea where we were going to land. Back at the cabin, we stripped off our wet clothes, carefully avoiding each other's eyes. I went into the bathroom to change while he changed in the main room. When I emerged, wrapped in a towel, he was already dressed in dry jeans and a thick wool sweater, stoking the fire in the stone fireplace. He had laid out a dry towel and a change of clothes for me on the hearth. A simple, thoughtful gesture that made my heart ache. I quickly dressed, my back to him, my skin prickling with the knowledge that he was in the room. I was hyper-aware of his presence, of his every movement. I could hear the soft scratch of his sweater, the quiet hiss of the logs as they caught fire, the sound of his breathing. Once I was dressed, I went and sat in the armchair opposite him, pulling my knees to my chest and wrapping my arms around them. The fire was roaring now, casting a warm, golden glow across the room and chasing away the last of the chill. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance. It wasn't the charged, uncomfortable silence from the canoe or the contemplative silence from the walk back. It was something different, softer, more open. Finally, he broke the quiet, his voice low and reflective. "You know," he began, his gaze fixed on the fire. Sarah was right. "I am distant." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. "It's like I've been going through the motions for years," he continued, turning a small piece of kindling over and over in his hands. "Job, apartment, girlfriend. It's the life I'm supposed to want, the one everyone expects. But it never feels real. It feels like I'm playing a part, and I'm not even a very good actor." He looked up from the fire and met my eyes. His gaze was startlingly direct, stripped of all its usual defenses. "Have you ever felt like that, Leo? Like you're just waiting for your real life to start?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was so close to the bone, so deeply resonant with my own quiet existence, that I couldn't breathe for a second. He saw me. In that moment, he truly saw me. Not just as his dependable, easygoing friend, but as someone who understood that specific, hollow ache of waiting. "Yeah," I whispered, the word barely audible. "Yeah, I have." He held my gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his green eyes, I saw a flicker of something I had never seen before. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, a shared vulnerability that bound us together more tightly than any storm ever could. He gave me a small, sad smile. I figured. He didn't ask me what I was waiting for. He didn't have to. In the warm, quiet glow of the fire, with the sound of the rain still dripping from the eaves outside, I had the distinct and terrifying feeling that he already knew. The next 2 days were a strange, delicate dance. The vulnerability that had cracked open by the fire didn't just disappear with the morning light. It lingered in the air between us, changing the dynamic of everything. We talked more than we had in years, not just about superficial things, but about our lives, our fears, our quiet disappointments. He talked about the pressure he felt from his family to settle down, the emptiness of his corporate job. I talked about the isolation of working from home, the feeling of being an observer in my own life. We skirted around the one topic that hung between us like a live wire, but its presence was felt in every conversation. The casual touches became more frequent and less ambiguous. He'd let his hand rest on my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. He started finding excuses to sit closer to me on the couch in the evenings, our legs pressed together from hip to knee as we read or just listened to the fire crackle. One night, I fell asleep reading, and I woke up with a start an hour later to find that my head was resting on his shoulder, and he had draped a blanket over both of us. His arm was loosely curled around me, and his own head was tilted against mine, his breathing deep and even. He was asleep. My heart stopped. I am here, in his arms. This is real. The thought was so overwhelming, so terrifyingly wonderful, that I didn't dare move. I stayed perfectly still, my body rigid, my senses on high alert. I studied the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the soft parting of his lips. I breathed in his scent, committing it to memory. This was a moment I would have to live on for years, I thought. A secret treasure to be locked away and revisited in my lonely apartment. I was so certain it was a fluke, a product of exhaustion and circumstance. I didn't let myself believe it could mean anything more. I eventually, carefully, extricated myself and went to my own bed, my entire body humming with a painful, unfulfilled longing. On our last night at the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken goodbyes and unresolved tension. We had to go back to the real world tomorrow, back to our separate lives, back to the carefully constructed roles we played. The thought of it was a lead weight in my stomach. I didn't want to leave this bubble, this strange, intimate world we had created. After a quiet dinner, Alex poured us both a generous measure of whiskey. To a week of thinking, he said, raising his glass. And not thinking, I added, clinking my glass against his. We drank in silence for a while, the whiskey warming a path down my throat and settling in my belly. The alcohol did little to calm my frayed nerves. If anything, it amplified them, making me feel even more raw and exposed. Alex was scrolling through photos on his phone, a small, nostalgic smile on his face. Hey, look at this one, he said, turning the phone toward me. It was a picture of us from college, taken nearly 10 years ago. We were at a party, both of us ridiculously young. I had a terrible haircut and was wearing a shirt that was 2 sizes too big. Alex had his arms slung around my shoulders, a wide, easy grin on his face. We looked happy, carefree. I remembered that night. I remembered the feeling of his arm around me, the smell of his cheap cologne, the way my heart had hammered in my chest. Even then, I had been hopelessly in love with him and utterly convinced he would never see me as anything more than his goofy, dependable friend. We were kids, I said, my voice thick with a sudden wave of nostalgia and regret. Yeah, he said softly, his eyes still on the photo. He was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing the outline of our younger selves on the screen. Then he looked up at me, his expression unreadable, his green eyes searching mine. The playful mood had vanished, replaced by an unnerving intensity. Leo, he said, his voice low and serious. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. My stomach twisted into a tight, anxious knot. Okay. He took a slow breath, as if bracing himself. All those years. All my girlfriends. Sarah, Jessica, Emily. All of them, he paused, his gaze unwavering. Were you ever happy for me? Not even once. The air left my lungs. The question was a scalpel, sharp and precise, cutting straight through a decade of pretense and polite lies. It was a direct challenge, a demand for the truth I had guarded so fiercely for so long. My mind raced, searching for an escape route, a platitude, a deflection. Of course, I was happy for you. I just wanted you to be happy. The words were on the tip of my tongue, the familiar, easy lie. But I couldn't say it. Not now. Not after this week. Not after the storm, the fire, the shared confessions, the weight of his head on my shoulder. Lying now would be a betrayal of whatever fragile, beautiful thing had grown between us in the quiet of these woods. I looked down at my hands, at the glass of whiskey I was clutching so tightly my knuckles were white. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting. He wasn't going to let me off the hook. No, I finally whispered, the word tearing itself from my throat. I raised my head and forced myself to meet his gaze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. This is it. This is the end. No, Alex. I wasn't. His expression didn't change. He just watched me, his face a mask of quiet intensity. He knew. He had to know. The question wasn't a question at all. It was a confirmation. He was giving me an opening, a chance to finally say it. I tried to be. I continued, the words tumbling out of me now, a torrent of truth I could no longer hold back. God, I tried. I went to the dinners, I smiled at the parties, I listened to you talk about them for hours. But every time you introduced me to a new girlfriend, it felt like a piece of me was breaking off. Because all I could think was that it should have been me. I stopped, my chest heaving, my eyes burning with unshed tears. I had said it. The secret I had carried like a stone in my gut for 10 years was finally out in the open, lying exposed and vulnerable between us. I braced myself for the inevitable recoil, the look of pity, the awkward apology, the careful, gentle words that would sever our friendship forever. But it didn't come. Alex didn't move. He just sat there, across the small space that separated us, his gaze never leaving my face. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the suddenly silent world. The look in his eyes wasn't pity. It wasn't disgust. It was something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like relief. My confession hung in the air, a fragile, trembling thing. I felt hollowed out, utterly exposed. I had just detonated the foundation of our entire friendship, and I had no idea what, if anything, would be left in the wreckage. I waited for him to say something, to do anything, but he remained perfectly still, his green eyes boring into me, stripping away my last defenses. The silence was a physical pressure, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I finally broke, the tension becoming unbearable. I let out a shaky, humorless laugh. "So, yeah," I said, my voice cracking. "There it is. I'm sorry, Alex. I never should have said anything. We can just forget this. We can go back tomorrow and—" "No." The word was quiet, but absolute. It cut through my rambling apology like a knife. He set his whiskey glass down on the floor with a soft thud and stood up. In 2 long strides, he crossed the space between us and stood over me, his presence looming, dominant. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I couldn't look at him. I stared at the worn pattern on the rug, my entire body bracing for the final, killing blow. He crouched down in front of me, so our faces were level. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, feel the warmth radiating from his body. He smelled of whiskey and wood smoke and something that was just him. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers came to rest gently against my jaw, his thumb stroking softly over the frantic pulse in my neck. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a tremor through my entire body. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated through my bones. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, I lifted my gaze to meet his. The intensity one saw there stole my breath. There was no anger, no pity. There was only a raw, unguarded emotion that mirrored the chaos in my own chest. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "how long I've waited to hear you say that?" My brain stuttered to a halt. The words didn't compute. They were a language I didn't understand. "What?" I breathed, the sound lost in the space between us. A sad, wry smile touched his lips. "All this time, I thought it was just me. I thought I was going crazy." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Every time I tried to move on, to be with someone else, you were always there, in the back of my head, the one I compared everyone to, the one they could never live up to." His thumb stroked my skin again, a soothing, hypnotic rhythm. "The truth is, Leo, I can't stop thinking about you. I haven't been able to for years." The world tilted on its axis. The floor fell away from beneath me. His words were a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. They were everything I had ever dreamed of hearing, and I couldn't believe they were real. It had to be a dream. The whiskey, the emotional exhaustion. But the calloused pad of his thumb against my skin was real. The warmth of his breath on my face was real. The undisguised yearning in his eyes was real. "Alex," I started, my voice thick with a decade of unshed tears. I didn't know what else to say. His name was a question, a plea, a prayer. "Shoo," he murmured. He leaned in closer, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing each other's air, our eyes closed. It was a moment of perfect, terrifying stillness. The calm before the storm. "I'm so tired of pretending," he whispered against my lips. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. There was no hesitation. It was a kiss of certainty, of desperation, of years of pent-up longing finally unleashed. His lips were soft but firm, moving against mine with a hunger that was staggering. His other hand came up to cradle the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me in place as if he was afraid I might bolt. I melted into him, a choked sob escaping my throat. My hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to grip his shoulders, holding on to him like a lifeline. I kissed him back with all the love and frustration and yearning I had kept locked away for a decade. It was clumsy and desperate and perfect. It was everything. It tasted of whiskey and smoke and salt from the tears that were now streaming down my face. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark with emotion, his breathing ragged. "This is real," he said, his voice hoarse. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A promise. Then he kissed me again, deeper this time. The kiss changed, becoming less about relief and more about pure, unadulterated want. His tongue traced the seam of my lips, and I opened for him without a second thought. He explored my mouth with a possessive, claiming heat that made my head spin. His hands left my face, sliding down my torso with an agonizing slowness. One hand splayed across my back, pulling me impossibly closer, until there was no space left between us at all. The other hand, his strong, capable hand, settled on my hip. His grip was firm, possessive. He squeezed, his fingers digging into the soft flesh there, and a shiver racked my body. He broke the kiss, his mouth moving to my jaw, trailing a line of fire down my neck. I tilted my head back, giving him access, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Alex," I breathed, my fingers tightening on his shoulders. "I told you," he growled against my skin, his voice a low, guttural sound that sent a shockwave of pure desire straight to my core. "I can't stop thinking about you." His hands tightened on my hips, grabbing me, anchoring me to him. He pulled my body flush against his, proving the truth of his words with the hard ridge of his own arousal. And then, right there, kneeling on the floor in front of the dying fire, he proved it with his mouth. I awoke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin window. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back in a tidal wave of heat and sensation. Alex, the confession, the kiss, everything that followed. A flush crept up my neck, and a slow, disbelieving smile spread across my face. I was in my own bed, tangled in the sheets. I reached out a hand, expecting to find him beside me, but the other side of the bed was empty and cold. The smile vanished. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the warm afterglow of the night. I sat up, my heart starting to pound a frantic, anxious rhythm. The cabin was silent. Too silent. He was gone. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. He regretted it. It was a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled, whiskey-soaked weakness. He had woken up this morning in the cold light of day and been horrified by what he'd done. He couldn't even face me. The old insecurities, the familiar chorus of self-doubt I had lived with for years, came roaring back to life. Of course, he regretted it. You're his friend. His pathetic, pining friend. You were a convenient comfort, nothing more. A rebound. I threw back the covers and got out of bed, my movements jerky. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip the fly. I had to find him. I had to know. Even if it was the worst, I had to hear it from him. I couldn't live in the uncertainty. I walked out into the main room. The fire was dead, a pile of gray ash in the hearth. The 2 whiskey glasses still sat on the floor where we had left them, a silent testament to the night before. His backpack was gone from the corner where it had been all week. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. He'd left. He'd actually packed his bag and left me here. The pain of it was so sharp, so intense, it made me gasp. My legs felt weak, and I had to grab the back of the armchair to steady myself. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have let myself believe, even for a few hours, that my fantasy could be real? I stood there for a long moment, my mind a maelstrom of regret and self-loathing. Then, through the window, I saw him. He was standing at the end of the dock, his back to the cabin, staring out at the mist rising off the lake. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his shoulders slumped. He hadn't left. He was just outside. The relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. But it was immediately followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. What was he thinking? Why was he out there alone instead of in bed with me? The awkwardness of the situation descended on me like a suffocating blanket. What do I say? How do we act now? Do we pretend it never happened? The thought was unbearable. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I couldn't hide in here forever. I had to face him. I squared my shoulders and walked to the door, my bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards. I pushed the screen door open, the one he had fixed, and the quiet squeak of its hinges sounded unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. He heard it. His head turned, and he looked over his shoulder at me. His expression was unreadable from this distance. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just watched me as I walked slowly down the grassy slope toward the dock. Each step felt like a mile. My stomach was a churning pit of nerves. This was it, the moment of truth. I stopped at the edge of the dock, a few feet away from him, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The morning air was cool and damp, and I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. I didn't know what to say. Hi seemed ridiculously inadequate. He turned fully to face me. His hair was messy from sleep, and he still had that dark stubble on his jaw. He looked tired, but the deep, soul-crushing weariness I had seen in his eyes when we arrived was gone. He looked calm. He was the one who finally broke the silence. His voice was quiet, a little rough with sleep. "I woke up early," he said, his gaze fixed on my face. "Couldn't sleep." "Oh," I said, my own voice sounding small. "Me neither," it was a lie. I had slept more deeply than I had in years, but I didn't want him to know that. An awkward silence fell between us again. He looked down at the weathered planks of the dock, then back up at me. A faint, conflicted look flickered across his face. Just as I was about to break, to fill the silence with a torrent of apologies and reassurances that he didn't have to worry, that I understood, he took a step toward me. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could see the tiny droplets of mist clinging to his eyelashes. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his palm warm and solid against my own. The simple, quiet gesture sent a wave of warmth rushing through me, chasing away the last of the morning chill and the icy dread in my heart. "I didn't regret it," he said softly, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He squeezed my hand. "I came out here to think about how not to screw this up." He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze honest and direct. "I slept better last night, Leo, than I have in years. I woke up this morning, and for the first time in a long, long time, I felt safe." The word hung in the air between us. Safe. It was such a simple word, but it held a world of meaning. It was what I had felt in his arms during the storm. It was what I had felt when he had held me by the fire. It was the one thing he had never found with anyone else. The reassurance was so complete, so absolute, that I felt the tension drain out of my body in a rush. The knot of fear in my stomach finally uncoiled. I squeezed his hand back, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Me too," I whispered. He smiled back, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. The sun was starting to burn through the mist, casting a golden light over the lake. It felt like the first day of the rest of my life. The drive home was the complete opposite of the drive up. The silence was no longer a weight, but a comfortable, shared space. The 6 inches between us on the bench seat were gone. I was sitting right next to him, my thigh pressed against his hand resting possessively on my knee. Every so often, his thumb would stroke back and forth, a small, repetitive gesture that sent shivers of pleasure up my spine. He had put on a different radio station, one that played classic rock, and we sang along badly to songs we both knew by heart. But even with the new, easy intimacy between us, a small, persistent voice of doubt still whispered in the back of my mind. It was my own internal test, my lifelong companion of fear and insecurity. "This is just the cabin," it would say. "A vacation romance. What happens when you get back to the real world? Back to your separate apartments, your real lives? Is he just on the rebound? Are you just a convenient port in a storm?" I tried to ignore it, to focus on the solid warmth of his hand on my leg, the easy smile on his face. But the fear was a stubborn weed, deeply rooted in the soil of my personality. I was an overthinker, a pessimist by nature. I had spent a decade convinced this was impossible. It was hard to suddenly accept that it was real. Alex, with his infuriating, wonderful perceptiveness, seemed to sense my internal struggle. As we got closer to the city, the landscape changing from dense forest to sprawling suburbs, he turned the radio down. "You're quiet again," he said, his voice soft. He glanced over at me, his brow furrowed with a slight concern. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I hesitated. I didn't want to ruin the perfect bubble we were in. I didn't want to sound needy or insecure. But I also knew, after everything that had happened, that we couldn't go back to hiding things. "I'm just trying to figure out what this is," I admitted, my gaze fixed on my hands, which were twisting in my lap. "What happens now, when we get back?" He was silent for a moment. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, into the gravelly shoulder of a quiet side street, and put it in park. He turned in his seat to face me fully, taking my hand from my lap and holding it in both of his. "Leo," he said, his voice serious. "Look at me." I met his eyes. They were clear and steady. "This isn't a rebound," he said, as if he had read my mind. What I felt for Sarah, for any of them. It was a shadow. It was me trying to force a puzzle piece into a space it didn't fit, because I was too scared to admit which piece I really wanted, He brought my hand up and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. And this, he continued, his gaze intense, is not just the cabin. This is us. Finally, he paused, letting the words sink in. I know this is new, and it might be weird for a bit, but I don't want to go back to the way things were. I can't. He took a deep breath. I want to try this. For real. No more pretending, no more hiding. I want to take you on a real date. I want to hold your hand in public. I want to wake up next to you in my own bed, not just in a cabin in the woods. His words were a conscious choice, a deliberate plan. It wasn't something he was just falling into. It was something he was actively, purposefully choosing. He was choosing me. The last of my doubt, the final vestiges of my fear, washed away in the face of his certainty. Okay, I said, a tear I didn't know was there slipping down my cheek. Okay, Alex, I want that too. He smiled, a beautiful, brilliant smile that lit up his whole face. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, sweet, searing kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. It wasn't the desperate, hungry kiss from the cabin. It was a kiss of quiet confidence, of a future shared. It was a kiss that said, we're home. When we finally pulled up in front of my apartment building, it felt different. The familiar gray facade didn't look as lonely or oppressive as it usually did. It just looked like a building. My home was no longer the four walls of my apartment. It was in the warm, solid presence of the man sitting next to me. We didn't say much as we unloaded my bag. The easy, comfortable silence had returned. He walked me to my door, carrying my duffel for me. It was a simple, domestic act that felt profound. At my door, I turned to face him, a sudden wave of awkwardness washing over me. This was the moment of separation, the first test of our new reality. Does he just say goodbye and leave? Does he come in? He seemed to sense my hesitation. He set my bag down and stepped into my space, backing me up against the door. He placed his hands on the door on either side of my head, trapping me in a loose, warm cage of his arms. I don't want to leave, he said, his voice a low murmur. Then don't. I breathed, my heart starting to race again. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. Let me take you to dinner tonight, he whispered. A real date. I'll pick you up at 7-inch. Okay, I agreed, my voice husky. He gave me one last, lingering kiss before pulling away. He picked up my bag, unlocked my door with the key I gave him, and placed it just inside. He looked back at me, his green eyes sparkling with a happiness I had never seen in him before. 7, he repeated, and then he turned and walked away, a new lightness in his step. I stood in my doorway and watched him go, a stupid, giddy smile plastered on my face. I went inside and closed the door, leaning back against it. My apartment was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was peaceful. It was the quiet anticipation of a life about to begin. Later that week, we found ourselves back in his kitchen, a space that had once felt so fraught with tension. Now, it was the easiest place in the world. We were making breakfast together, a lazy Saturday morning unfolding around us. I was at the stove, scrambling eggs, while he stood at the counter, meticulously buttering toast. We moved around each other in a comfortable, synchronized dance, our bodies seeming to know instinctively where the other would be. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of coffee, bacon, and toasted bread filled the small space. It was so simple, so domestic, so wonderfully, beautifully normal. He came up behind me as I was sliding the eggs onto our plates. He wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned back into his embrace, my head tilting to rest against his. His arms tightened around me, holding me securely. This is nice, he murmured into my ear, his voice warm and content. Yeah, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. It is. We stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, the sizzle of the cooling pan the only sound. In that quiet, simple moment, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The yearning ache that had been my constant companion for a decade was gone. The loneliness that had defined my existence had vanished. I turned in his arms to face him, looping my own arms around his neck. He looked down at me, his expression soft, his eyes full of a quiet, steady love that took my breath away. All those years, I had been an observer, watching my life, and his, from a safe distance. I had been waiting for my real life to begin. I looked up at the man holding me, the man who had seen me, truly seen me, and I understood. I was no longer waiting. I was home.